Good afternoon. Woo, the speaker works. Hello, my name is Sarah. Welcome to the library. I'm so glad that you're here. This is National Library Week, and we're very excited to be celebrating libraries in a way where we get to celebrate and recognize publications from some of our faculty authors. Let me start with a prayer. Father God, thank you so much for Regent University, and thank you for this library. Please bless every single person touched by this library and the information that's in it. God, we also ask you to please be with our speakers today, and to please bless the food that we're eating to the nourishment of our bodies. In your name we ask, amen. Let me give you an overview of how today's going to work. We have three different speakers, actually four different speakers, and I'll be introducing them, and then they're going to talk a little bit about their books and maybe share some readings and information about their books. And then we'll have Q&A, and we do have a microphone, and we're recording this. So if you have a question, please wait until we can get to you with a microphone. And then we'll go on to the next speaker. After we have all of the three presentations, we will then announce the winner of the Nook, and we did have a library survey, and Sandy's going to hold up the Nook and show it to you. This is the actual Nook out of the bag. There's the Nook. So if you were one of the people who took the library survey, you may have won the Nook. We'll announce that winner at the end. And then we would invite you to purchase a copy of the books if you want them, or if you have them and brought them, we'll have all of the authors sitting at tables signing autographs. So that is the plan, and we're going to get started with our first speaker. Dr. Susanna Clements joined Regent University's School of Undergraduate Studies in July 2007. She is a British literature specialist with a particular interest in Victorian fiction and poetry. She earned her MA and PhD from the University of South Carolina, specializing in 19th century British literature. She's going to be talking to us about her new book called The Vampire Defanged, and I want to share with you just a few things that other people have said about her book. Publishers Weekly wrote, in this astute survey, she, Dr. Clements, argues that Christian theology, once essential to understanding the vampire, has been lost through decades of change in vampire characterization, effectively defanging the vampire of meaningful theological bite. Clements writes well and persuasively as she argues that vampires are more than just monsters to us, demonstrating that now as ever, the vampire represents our darkest anxieties and our most ardent desires. There are also a lot of weblogs out there of people who write book reviews, and I found one that I thought was really cute. The web is called Book Reviews from a Christian Girl, Her Favorites and Her Not-So-Favorites. And what she said about this book was fantastic, in all capital letters. You all probably know my views on vampires. They're evil. But this book is fascinating no matter what your views on vampires are. So with that in mind, please join me in welcoming Dr. Susanna Clements.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you all for coming out here to listen to us talk a little bit about our books. Everyone thinks because I wrote a book on vampires that I must be a vampire person, but I'm here to tell you that I'm not. Today I'm going to talk briefly about what led me to write this book, and then I'm going to read a couple of short paragraphs from the introduction to give you a taste of the purpose and philosophy underlying it. So when I was in graduate school, I had a friend who told me about a great new television show that she just discovered. My friend was getting her MA in English with me, and she had also been that year the first runner-up at the Miss Georgia beauty pageant. And so she had an interesting combination of interests, and her highest recommendation for the show was, this is a quote, "It has good stories, good writing, and good clothes." So while the fashion piece wasn't of interest to me, I did check out this television show, even though I was a little skeptical about the name of it, which was Buffy the Vampire Slayer. So the first episode I watched of Buffy was the 5th one in the series, and the name of the episode was Never Kill a Boy on the First Date, and I loved it. I loved that episode. I loved the entire series, and I watched it committedly throughout the 7 seasons of the show. It had its highs and lows, but it really was throughout very well written and very thoughtfully explored themes that I found really compelling, themes of sin and sacrifice, which spoke to me as someone interested in stories and as a Christian. So, but for quite a few years, that was it. That was my only interest in vampires. When people thought I was a vampire person because I was a fan of Buffy, I reminded them that Buffy actually killed vampires. So I was not a vampire person. But for the last several years, particularly since I came to Regent 4 years ago, I started watching in the culture around us how vampires became more and more popular. There were more books and movies and television shows about vampires. And I was interested in that. I didn't actually read many of the books or watch any of the shows, but I was interested in it as a cultural phenomenon. I didn't read Twilight, even as Twilight became so popular. I didn't watch True Blood, even as True Blood got this real fan momentum behind it. I didn't really put any effort into exploring the vampire phenomena, but I was kind of interested in it. And so I thought back to Dracula, which I had skimmed in high school. Not paying much attention to it. And I thought I would go back to the beginning to see what Stoker had done with the vampire, and then kind of compare it to what was happening in the culture with vampires. So I read Dracula really for the first time 3.5 years ago. And I loved it. I loved it. And I thought it was so interesting, very compelling, and very Christian. And that's where I got the germ of inspiration for this book, thinking about what a Christian book Dracula was, and then looking at what had happened to the figure of the vampire in culture, how much it had changed since then. And I thought, since I was interested in it, and people are obviously interested in vampires, there might be a book in it. So I started doing a little bit of research to see what was out there, and I put together a book proposal. I put together the book proposal before I'd read a lot of the vampire stuff I would be writing about. But I had a plan, and I basically knew the argument that I was going to make. I just didn't have all the details nuanced out. So I sent the proposal to Brazos, which I thought would be the best fit, and because vampires are so interesting to people, they liked it. And so I got a contract on the proposal, and then I had to write the book. That meant I had to read all of this stuff and watch all of these shows. And they wanted the manuscript very quickly, so it was a short process. I spent an entire week immersed in Anne Rice's Vampire Chronicles, which I had never read before, and another week on Sticky Stackhouse and the Southern Vampire Mysteries, which was a better week than the Anne Rice week. And I rewatched all the episodes of Buffy straight through. It took about a week and a half to get through them all. And so the research for this book was actually, for the most part, pretty enjoyable. There are some of the texts that I'm dealing with that have academic research done on that. So I did I looked into the scholarship that's already been done. There's a lot on Buffy, and there's a lot on Dracula. There's not that much on Twilight, and there's not that much on some of the other stuff we read. So I did all of that in a span of a few months, and this is the result. To give you a sense of the direction and the argument that I take in the book, I'm just going to read a couple of short paragraphs from the introduction, because I think that says it more concisely than I could. This is from a section of the introduction called Why Should Christians Care About Vampires? Christians have been slow to embrace the vampire phenomenon. Only within the last couple of years has the first Christian vampire fiction been released, and many Christians find even that rather dubious. Christians often respond to the vampire phenomenon by either trivializing or demonizing it, brushing it aside as insignificant, or labeling an entire century of imaginative production as evil and anti-Christian. In these pages, I will seek to counter both responses. And I'm going to skip a couple paragraphs here and get to the philosophy part. Books and films and television programs have power over us, whether we recognize it or not. Only reading and viewing vampire stories well can allow us to engage them constructively. It would be easy for us to naively declare that all vampires are bad, or declare the opposite, like Sookie Stackhouse in True Blood, she says in her Southern accent. I don't think Jesus would mind if someone was a vampire. Unfortunately, the approach a lot of Christians take toward the vampire phenomenon is nearly as uninformed. Even in literary studies, the art of reading well, examining a text closely to discover what it actually says, is being replaced by a focus on socio-political agendas. More than anyone else, Christians should know how to read well and how to view television and film well. And we should read the culture around us as deeply and thoughtfully as we read canonical literature. The Vampire Defanged offers a close reading of selected vampire stories as a means of better understanding our culture through the lens of the transforming vampire myth. So this is not a history of vampire mythology. I don't go all the way back and try to trace the root of the words or the images that are usually used with the vampire figure. It's instead tracing the way this metaphor of the vampire, the way the figure of the vampire has transformed in the last 2 centuries, going from the Christian roots to what we see today, which is the vampire as a romantic hero, completely secularized in a lot of ways. So, and then I think about the implications for Christians, what Christians should do with all the vampires around us, besides stake them in the heart. And I will just close by saying I'm still not a vampire person.
Questions? The person on the farthest side of the room.
I was just kind of curious about, you referred to the Christian roots and how, vampires could be, fought off with the cross and that sort of thing. Could you talk about a little bit about how that's dramatically changed with the vampire characters?
Yes, I think traditional portraits, it's usually the religious symbols, the Christian symbols that are able to fight against them. And the vampire is an embodiment of sin. We see that in Dracula very clearly, exploring what sin looks like and the nature of sin. In later portraits, you still see sometimes some of those Christian apparatus connected to it, but it's lost a lot of its meaning. And now, like in Twilight, the cross the cross is meaningless to a vampire. It doesn't affect a vampire. And holy water and all the other Christian symbols that could fight against it no longer matter at all. And I think it's pretty clear that that says something about what happened in our culture in terms of what matters to us and what we think has power. Yeah.
Another question?
Hi. Just curious whether you think that Christians should follow this literature, or whether we should just stay away from it and just leave it on the bookshelves.
That's actually a good question, and I think you can see both responses, and I think the best answer is we need to take each text individually. So I don't think we can make some sort of generalization about all vampire literature, all vampire movies or television, and say all of it is helpful or worthwhile, or all of it is not worthwhile or not worth reading at all. Because I think there's a lot of really important thematic exploration and artistic expression that happens to use the metaphor of the vampire, and I think that can be very worthwhile for Christians to read or watch or think about. But some of it is probably not worth our time. And Christian or non-Christian, there's not enough artistic value in it to make it worth our time. So I think my approach is generally you can't make generalizations about a genre. You have to look at each individual text to make informed decisions.
Yes.
In our environment, you're sort of controversial. Do you feel any tension with colleagues and students with regard to the topic, and how do you deal with that?
I actually have not. Maybe they just haven't told me. Maybe our students are very polite. They are, so maybe they're afraid to say anything. But I have actually found it quite welcoming. I have a little spiel that I give to explain what I'm doing and why it's worthwhile. And I think that explanation is necessary for people to understand or see my approach. But I really have not felt much tension or opposition, certainly not at the Regent community. There have been at least one blog I found about the book online where I think it was the fact that it was about vampires that kind of threw her off the whole book. And so I'm sure that that idea is out there, but I haven't experienced it significantly. Yeah.
Please join me in thanking Dr. Clements.
Thank you.
And once again, we do have copies of The Vampire Defanged at the back tables. And you can get your copy personally autographed in a few minutes. Okay. Dr. Graham Twelftree is Distinguished Professor of New Testament in the School of Divinity. His research and teaching focus on the historical Jesus, as well as on miracles and exorcism, which is why he's going right after the vampire presentation. Dr. Twelftree received an MA from Oxford and his PhD at the University of Nottingham. He is a prolific writer, researcher, reader, and library user. And did any of you know that he also has his own page on Wikipedia? Did you know that, Dr. Twelftree? Today, we celebrate the publication of his latest work, The Cambridge Companion to Miracles. This book was written by international experts and provides an authoritative and comparative study of miracles in the major world religions, as well as older indigenous religions. The authors promote discussion of the problems of miracles in our diverse and secular culture and of the value of miracles in religious belief. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Twelftree.
Well, thank you. It's lovely to see you. It's amazing what a crowd a pizza will bring. Well, I've discovered that a good book has a gestation period far exceeding all other known forms of parenting. From conception to safe delivery, this book kept us waiting for nigh on 5 years, and along the way required the attention of over 2,250 emails. The baby, the book, I'd like to introduce to you is The Cambridge Companion to Miracle. It's a collection of essays edited and with a chapter by my wife's present husband. Much of the prenatal life of the book was taken up establishing the right mix of chapters and contributors, identifying highly qualified academics across the globe who could deal with the topics and had a reputation for delivering quality work on time, involved extended searches and discussions with the press. Eventually, the cast of 17 contributors and chapters was assembled. Contributors come from the University of Western Australia, from a number of Canadian institutions and some in this country, as well as from the universities of Birmingham, Bristol, Cambridge, Durham and Oxford in Britain. And there's also one, the last one, from the University of Southern Denmark. We, the readers, I think, are in debt to them for their work that they contributed and for all the research, the writing and revising to make the book as good as it is. And I'm also in debt for the gracious way they fulfilled their tasks. I find myself agreeing with Leslie Stephen, the father of Virginia Woolf and Vanessa Bell. He said, well knowing from his share of editing, that punctuality and consideration were the two cardinal virtues of a contributor. I was once told by someone who had obviously not tried it that if you can't write, then you can always edit. This is not my first attempt at editing, And those who have tried it know that there's much pain and controlled breathing in the delivery room. To share my pain, between 2 and 4, and in some cases, if my memory serves me correctly, 5 or 6 anonymous peer reviewers were marshalled to read and report on each chapter or its rewrite. The authors were then able to revise their chapters, in some cases a number of times, to produce the most robust and readable pieces possible. Sadly, in the nature of things, the identity of these around 60 reviewers will forever remain unknown. But here, on behalf of the contributors, and indeed those of us who are the readers, I offer sincere thanks to these who gave freely of their time and expertise to work very carefully on a project that was not theirs. No author, not even a collection of authors, is entire of themselves but a piece of the publishing process. Folk at Cambridge, especially Kate Brett, the senior commissioning editor, in the early stages of the project provided initial enthusiasm and guidance. Latterly, Laura Morris, the religious studies editor for the press, carried the burden of the organisational responsibility. And Anne Lewis was an exceptional copy editor for whose work we are very grateful. I'm pleased to say that on Monday I took delivery of some advanced copies of the book in question. When in your turn you are able to hold the infant, I trust you think it handsome and full of promise. The promise is to provide an authoritative and comparative study of miracles through examining not only Hinduism, Islam, Buddhism, Christianity and Judaism, but indigenous or traditional religions as well. Also, the miracles of Jesus are contextualised through chapters on the Hebrew Bible, classical culture to the Romans, Second Temple and early Rabbinic Judaism, as well as Christianity. And there are chapters on miracles in the Middle Ages, on issues in the history of the debates of miracles, on philosophers and miracles, on the definition and meaning of miracles. And the final chapter is an exploration of the impact on patients of faith in healing miracles. When you read the book, I think a couple of issues are likely to strike you. One is that miracle is important in all the major religious traditions. So the question arises, what are we to make of similar miracles being found in different religions? Just as Jesus fed a crowd with a small amount of food, so did a chief disciple of the Buddha. Not only is Jesus said to walk on water and give sight to the blind, there are also stories of Sufi saints of Islam accomplishing the same feats. Both Jesus and Buddha are said to have had miraculous births. Another issue that will arise for the reader is this. Those who are not religious or don't consider it possible to establish that miracles have taken place are likely to see the relativity inherent in their generally Western explanations of their world. An unwillingness to acknowledge the reality of the enchanted world of others might be justly perceived as another expression of cultural or intellectual colonialism. Apart from these rather large issues, there are a number of pedal notes, recurring sub-themes heard through the text of the book. One is the problem of defining miracle. For example, for a Christian, a miracle might be an unusual event resulting from divine intervention. But for a Buddhist, a miracle would be the natural expression of the power of the mind of a holy man. Second is the ambiguity of miracle. An event seen and understood by some but missed or at least supposedly misunderstood by others has led more than one tradition to hold that miracles could neither create faith in the unbeliever nor strengthen the belief of the already faithful. Perhaps then, a miracle can only be perceived or not and interpreted against an existing worldview, faith, religion or community, and its set of perceptions. In other words, if you're lost, just remember this sentence. A miracle is no more than my way of seeing as extraordinary what another sees as ordinary. Third is the meaning of miracle. They might equally be claimed as evidence for the goodness of the deity as for his tragic neglect of those who don't experience the mercy or the marvel. Or miracles could be taken as evidence of an incompetent creator meddling in an unfinished or imperfect work. Alternatively, according to some, if miracles occur in a world overseen by a perfect, all-powerful creator, they must have been planned from the beginning. So how do the Jews interpret a God who saves them from Pharaoh, but not from Hitler? Perhaps then true faith has nothing to do with fortune, as Kenneth Seeskin, one of our writers, says. Fourth, there are 5, so don't worry. Fourth is the place of miracles in the dispute along the uncertain borders between religions and cultures. For example, in 10th century battles with the Christians, Muslims pointed out that if the miracles of Jesus were also seen in the life of Moses, there can be no difference between them as prophets. This gives rise to hints in this book of the view that miracles are of doubtful value in proselytizing or in establishing the divine or special status of the miracle worker. Lastly, from time to time, key individuals come to the fore. Not only founding fathers of the various religions, Moses, Buddha, Jesus, Muhammad, but there is also evidence of other individuals of brilliance who have given attention to the problem of miracle and whose views still merit our consideration. St. Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, Baruch Spinoza, and David Hume, for example. Well, this book doesn't claim to cover all the territory and may not answer all the questions raised by a thoughtful person. But in this collection of essays, an attempt has been made to provide more than enough raw material for fruitful discussion, questioning and reflection on the perennial set of problems associated with the idea of miracle. One of the special things about any book is the dedication page. The dedication in this book is to one, or this book is dedicated to one of your favourite people and his friends. Let me read the dedication page. To Bob Sivany and all the other librarians who support our work. So I finish my part today, by presenting a copy to Bob, who well represents that class of highly professional librarians without whom so much research would not be possible. So thank you, Bob.
Questions for Dr. Palfrey?
I don't mind if you don't ask any. Or at least ask an easy one.
Yeah, okay.
I wonder if you come to any conclusions that you can share with us how Christianity is maybe distinctive. You mentioned a number of other religions.
Yes, that was a question I was hoping you wouldn't ask. It is extremely difficult to answer, and I think it's difficult to answer in that we truly want to build bridges to other religions so that we can talk with them. And for us to condemn the other does great damage to them and to us. My own interest in miracles centres around Jesus and the early church, and one of the things that was recognised as distinctive, or two things, was the deeply human and compassionate dimension of miracle for Christians, and that the miracle worker and the miracles themselves had a quality about them that was different and attractive. And that to me seems more than enough.
Another question? Well, to show you how cutting edge we are, Dr. Twelfth-Tree's book hasn't even been published yet. But we have a few copies, and we'll sell them to the highest bidder. We'll start that. I'm kidding. We do have a few copies of this book, but May 1st is the actual publication date. So please do stick around and talk to Dr. Twelfth-Tree if you'd like to get his autograph on one of the valuable books back there on the table. Okay, for our final book, I'm going to be introducing two people. And first of all, Dr. Alan Arroyo is Dean and Professor in the School of Education here at Regent University. He has co-authored professional publications ranging from dealing with school discipline issues to meeting the needs of students with disabilities. His current research interests are in the areas of leadership, character education, and building resilience in youth. Dr. Hope Jordan is currently a full professor who directs the K-12 Special Education Program, the Autism Certificate Program, and directs the EDS and Leadership. Her work in teacher-leader preparation has resulted in hundreds of teachers and leaders in the field who are better prepared to teach and lead 21st century students. Doctors Arroyo and Jordan edited the book just published titled The Secret Kingdom for Educators, based on Dr. Pat Robertson's bestseller, The Secret Kingdom. Please join me in welcoming Drs. Arroyo and Jordan.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Dean Barron. You know, I thought of the real reason why we're up here. Hope and I were on Dean Barron's search committee as dean, and this is her way of paying us back. It has nothing to do with the book. It really doesn't. We could talk a long time, of course, as the other authors could, about how this book developed. But since all of you are family and we're in the Pat Robertson fold, imagine trying to write a book based on the work that Dr. Robertson said himself was his favorite book. So it actually took a few years for me to convince him that this was a real good thing. I think it was more that, he had his mind on many other things. But, the Lord peaked in his heart 2 or 3 years ago to come back out and start teaching on the Secret Kingdom again. And that's when I wrote the book, and I talked to Hope, and I said, maybe now's the time. And in December of 2009, I sat down with him, and he gave us the green light. And he's been involved with it. But here's the bottom line. To grossly paraphrase C.S. Lewis, he said, if you look over history on the Christians that made a difference in this world, it's that they thought about mostly the other world. And this is what Dr. Robertson has to say. I'm no fool, I'm going to quote him. He was saying how he was seeking the Lord for 5 years to really open up and show him what the Lord had for him in the Bible. And this is already, Pat had already established himself as a great man of God and with fantastic wisdom. But he said, then one day, a simple thought revolutionized my thinking. And this is what it is. As Christians, we believe that Jesus Christ is God. That is precisely what he said when he claimed, I and the Father are one. The next stage is that realization was equally clear. If Jesus is God, then his clear statements that are not limited in regard to time, let's see, I'm skipping my place. Time, not limited to time, place, or recipient, are actually universal truths which have the same force in the metaphysical world that the law of gravity, the law of thermodynamics, and other laws would have in the physical world. In other words, the principles that Jesus enunciated are not just for Christians and Jews, but they apply to all men in all cultures everywhere, even in public schools. And so and of course, homeschools and Christian schools, we all need to seek the kingdom as well. So we put out feelers with the faculty on who is feeling led to contribute to this work. And some faculty said, we know we're putting our careers on the line, but they did. We had 10 people who volunteered, and I'm telling you, the Lord was in this. Dr. Robertson met with us a couple of times, blessed us, said go forward. He read drafts. He was just very supportive, full steam ahead. And basically, you know, if you haven't read The Secret Kingdom, I really recommend that you read it first before you read this, because we really built on this, on The Secret Kingdom. But it's basically there are 10 laws, and if you use these laws, you tap into the other world. And we have case studies, we have research, we have all kinds of things from the 10 contributors that back that up and show evidence to that effect. So Dr. Jordan actually wrote on 2 of those laws, so I'm going to turn it over to her and talk about that.
I'd like to start by saying that Dr. Arroyo is right. We knew that God's hand had to be in it. I knew that when I walked into the room with those 10 people and went, oh no, this is never going to work. Because we have such diverse personalities and areas of expertise and thoughts on our beliefs, and I thought, how is this all going to come together? So we knew in the end when it did come together that God's hand was on it. It was kind of that balance that Dr. Gertson was talking about today in chapel of how much is God's will and how much is our will. When do we go forward and act on something? But I wanted to share with you a little bit of what's in the book. Dr. Arroyo started out by talking about the downturn of American education. And then he took that to a positive place. And tapping into the power of God's invisible world. Dr. Haynes talked about the framework. We had Dr. James Sweezy, who talked about the law of use and gets into we got into the laws then. The law of reciprocity was handled by Dr. William Cox. Dr. Haynes again, the law of perseverance. The law of fidelity was Dr. George Seelig. Dr. Joan Hoskins handled the law of unity. I did the law of change and the law of greatness. Dr. Don Finn worked on the law of responsibility. Dr. Elizabeth Hunter, who's over there, did the law of miracles and the law of dominion by Dr. Cox. And Dr. Helen Stiff Williams kind of pulled it all together for us, and she talked about specific applications for teachers. By the way, the book is for teachers and for leaders in any school situation. And then we had some appendices that gave some really practical kinds of things. So those are the 10 people who got together. And what we did with each chapter, where the difficult part that Dr. Arroyo talked about was we're working with Dr. Robertson's work here. You know, how do we stay true to that and make sure that we honor that and take away from it what we can for school settings, for educators? And we wanted to speak to Christian educators, but we realized that many of the Christian educators, teachers and leaders we work with are in the public schools. So, you know, what does their faith have to do? How does it exhibit itself in the public schools? And these laws make it very real. So each chapter started out with talking about the law and Dr. Robertson's vision for that law, the biblical principle behind. So Dr. Arroyo asked me to share a little bit about one of my chapters, and one of the chapters I worked on was the law of change. So I started out by going to Dr. Robertson's work and sort of summarizing what it was he said about the law of change. And one of the things he talks about with change is that we can't put new wine in old wine skins. So sometimes we're beating our head against the wall if we're trying to make changes and God's not in it yet, and the wineskins are not new and ready for that change. So I developed that a little bit. Then I went into some of the Secret Kingdom principles were to recognize that change begins with your own change of heart, to remain open so that God can prepare you to be his agent for change. As you encounter a problem in education, to pray for discernment, to ask for God to give you his mandate for action, and to keep God's principles the focus in your prayer and what you're doing. And then I sort of developed all of those thoughts a little bit, and then I went into an example, because what Dr. Robertson shares is that the secret kingdom principles are at work whether we know it and are Christians using them or not. They're still working. So I talked about a school that I went and visited, the Epiphany School, which is in North Carolina. Anybody know Nicholas Sparks? Yeah, pretty important guy. He saw a need for some change in schools in North Carolina, so he went out and spoke to the people, and whether he intentionally did it or not, he used the Secret Kingdom Change principles and developed a school in New Bern, North Carolina, which is absolutely wonderful, the Epiphany School. So I gave that as an example. I talked about the American Indian Public Charter School, which is another example of how some of those change principles were at work. Then I talked a little bit about change in the 21st century and related change to some change theorists that we read about all the time. Clayton Christensen, Michael Horn, Curtis Johnson, Tony Wagner, James Comer, people that we're used to reading about when we talk about change. So related that to topics that whether or not you're Christian, you know these authors in the world of education. And then ended the chapter with some personal application sorts of steps. So every chapter takes that same sort of course where we start with Dr. Robertson's principle, we tell some stories, look at what's really going on in the real world, and then relate it directly to the field of education. It was a great experience for me to have an opportunity to work with so many. You know, I look at them every day and talk to them every day, and I know how talented they are and what experts they are, but I was really grateful that I had the opportunity to work with them on this project. Did you have any closing comments to make? After Vampires and Miracles? The Secret Kingdom, Pat Robertson's Secret Kingdom.
Thank you. Questions?
You get to do answers.
Come on, we have to have a hard question for Dr. Arroyo.
Right. Carrie, don't you have a hard question for Dr. Roy? Okay, ask him an easy question.
Well, we do have copies of this book in the back, and so please, if you're interested, get a copy of the book, and Drs. Arroyo and Jordan will be sitting at a table over here and happy to sign autographs. I thank you very much. Okay, before we close, we want to end by announcing the winner of our Nook. And so we do a survey every year of the library. And this year we had over 750 responses, which is great. Last year we only had 500. So thank you all so much for responding to that survey. A random number calculator was used to select the winner. And this year, the winning number belongs to a staff member, Charity Mack from the School of Education. She is the records coordinator and the winner of the new Nook. And actually, this celebration was preempted by a bigger celebration, which was her little baby girl. Charity had a baby just a few days ago. And so we will send her that Nook full of Dr. Seuss books, right? Thank you all so much for coming. Please do take a moment to speak with our authors, grab a book, and get some autographs. Thank you.